Greetings. I'm Adam Jacoby, Director of Forensics and the Speech and Debate Squads at Rufus King International Baccalaureate High School in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Americans value the free and open society that values the crux of our national motto, A pluribus unum, out of many, one. Each time citizens vote, they exercise their role in the United States government by contributing to a decision as to who will represent their interests in making the laws that shape our lives and society. Any forensic event celebrates the expression of this spirit, but none models it in as unique a way as Student Congress, a student-driven event where debaters write their own legislation, research the bills proposed by the various attending schools, and prepare to speak prior to tournaments. During debate, participants listen carefully and respond to issues raised by their peers. After all arguments are heard, students vote on whether to pass the bills into law. Students also run each chamber at a tournament, serving as the presiding officer who calls on debaters to give speeches supporting or opposing each bill. Before a Congress session begins, students may caucus or meet informally to determine an agenda based on the full docket of legislation sent to the participating schools. Otherwise, a formal rules committee, often comprised of one student representative from each school, will suggest an agenda to be used for the duration of that tournament. An adult parliamentarian who moderates the session will facilitate an election of the student presiding officer, who upon election then calls the meeting to order and then asks for an author or sponsor to speak and introduce the first legislation on the agenda. The author or sponsor speech has the important task of setting the boundaries for debate on an issue. These speeches tend to be more polished and include a variety of issues that should be addressed by both opposing speakers and elaborated on by supporting speakers. Following this first speech is a mandatory 2-minute questioning period where the author or sponsor clarifies points made in the speech and fields questions about the legislation itself. The presiding officer then excuses the speaker, asking him or her to have a seat, and then says, "Negative speakers, please rise." Following the author or sponsor are alternating negative and affirmative speeches of up to 3 minutes apiece, with a mandatory 1-minute questioning period after each speech. If no speakers stand for a particular side of debate, the presiding officer may say, "While the chair frowns on one-sided debate," and then call for a speaker on the same side as the previous speech. When it is clear that no one wishes to speak, the presiding officer may simply say, "Are you ready for the question?" and then proceed to taking a vote on the legislation. If it appears there are no new arguments being made, the members of the chamber may take a shortcut by moving the previous question, which effectively means they want to close debate. This motion, however, requires a 2/3 vote because it limits the free speech rights of the minority, and care must be taken in Student Congress because it is a competition that students are not manipulating procedure to benefit their competitive standing, because judges will note rude and manipulative behavior and subtract points accordingly. Effective congressional debaters know how to construct compelling arguments supported by credible evidence which indicate the implications and impacts of those claims. They realize that Congress is a form of debate, so it's paramount to respond and react to previous points made by other speakers, not to simply rehash or repeat what other students have already said. A good clue that a speaker is using such spontaneity is that they are speaking more extemporaneously rather than reading a speech word for word from a manuscript. Congressional debaters also have finely tuned interpersonal skills, knowing the value of interacting with each other in a meaningful way toward the session's ultimate goal, theoretically, of charting a course of legislative action for the United States of America. Student presiding officers understand how a structured, efficient chamber engenders debate, and they avoid the pitfall of allowing students to emphasize motions instead of speaking. The best presiding officers make parliamentary procedure in a chamber transparent so that the true purpose of the framework of competitive debate can be made. Speeches. And good word economy goes a long way toward allowing presiding officers to allow for more speeches. Less emphasis on the presiding officer, more emphasis on the speakers. Responding to opposing arguments is what makes debate more than just public speaking. However, like speechwriters, debaters must persuade, convince, and motivate an audience. Ancient Roman public speaking expert Quintilian stressed the importance of being a good person who speaks well. Through the process of debate, the ultimate goal of Student Congress is to teach leadership skills that enable young people to lead successful lives in our democratic society. The proof of leadership training is apparent. Many members of the actual U.S. Congress, presidents of businesses, broadcast journalists, and entertainers participated in academic debate as students. As you watch this video clip, watch for these qualities in the speakers, presiding officer, and other legislators in the session. Note the professional demeanor and appearance of the students. Part of Student Congress is about playing the part of a senator or representative, which involves projecting some degree of that authority. The National Forensic League website, www.nflonline.org, offers several resources for Student Congress debate, and www.studentcongressdebate.org is a new community dedicated to educating coaches and students and advocating for the event. Finally, it's always a good idea to pick up a copy of Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised, a great instructional guide on the parliamentary process. Decisions that affect us in our everyday lives originate in boards, committees, and commissions that utilize parliamentary procedure. Experience in Student Congress is an invaluable asset for any student, which will last a lifetime. Thank you, and good luck in your next Congress session.
Give me a nod when you're ready.
At your leisure, ma'am.
Thank you. As we look to foreign policy today, the most frightening thing is that the words of Stephen Colbert have finally become clear.
The next piece of legislation is concerning the war on terror. I will read the full text of this piece of legislation. Thank you very much, sir. First whereas clause. On September 18th, 2001, the United States Congress passed the authorization for use of military force with only one dissenting vote. Whereas this resolution authorized the President of the United States to use, quote, all necessary and appropriate force, end quote, in order to eliminate the authors of September 11th attacks and prevent future terrorist attacks. And whereas the resolution provides for the statutory basis for the Bush administration's military war on terror. And whereas the resolution gives unchecked discretion to the President to determine which nations, organizations, and persons were responsible for the September 11th attacks and may commit such attacks in the future. And whereas the Bush administration has used this broad authorization as a pretext to establish military regimes in Afghanistan and Iraq, and to indefinitely detain terror suspects as, quote, enemy combatants without formal legal charge. And whereas the military approach to terrorism has proven ineffective at increasing the security of the United States and harmful to the civilian populations worldwide, and whereas the prosecution of the war on terror has alienated traditional allies of the United States and destroys American standing in the Arab and Muslim world. Therefore, be it resolved by the Student Congress here assembled that the authorization for use of military force of September 18th, 2001 shall be repealed, thus ending the military war on terror. Are there any sponsors on this piece of legislation? We'll now move towards recency, and since you have all spoken once, Mr. Tokars, you do have the floor.
I do thank the chair, and for the judges, that is Representative David Tokars, T-O-K-A-R-Z. Unfortunately, I forgot my placard at the restaurant we attended for lunch, so you'll have to do with my spelling. As always, at the leisure of the judges, parliamentarian, presiding officer in the chamber before me.
At your leisure, sir.
Thank you. Just give me a nod when you're ready, please. Fellow representatives, the most important conflict in the 21st century that faces the United States of America is that of the war on terror. Now, most of you are probably wondering right now why I sponsored this piece of legislation. But I do so because I believe that the United States of America has no choice but to defend itself against the enemies of this country, specifically Al-Qaeda. And that the wars that we are currently fighting are mere distractions from this. And because of these distractions, we have only one option as a Congress. That option, to pass this piece of legislation, to leave Iraq, to leave Afghanistan, and to actually wage war against the enemy that we need to fight, Al-Qaeda. Now, first, I'd like to examine what the United States presence overseas does to the Arab impressions of Americans. And we can look to an Economist article dated November 24th, 2005, which states that moderate Muslim clerics have grown increasingly concerned at the abuse of the declaration of jihad. In fact, one of the largest firebrand clerics in the Middle East, who tutored Muqtada al-Sadr, Sheikh Abu Muhammad al-Makis, who is a prominent radical firebrand, actually labeled the Iraqi jihad as something that was too overblown. In fact, we see that the Muslim world condemns the violence against their own people as just that, violence against Muslim and Arab peoples. The only problem, and the only thing standing in the way of the Arab people in this region from rising up, is the fact that the United States is currently in Iraq. And this Economist article supports that when it says that the intrusion of foreign armies into Iraq is the primary reason why blood is being spilled in the streets of cities in the Middle East. And because of that, we see withdrawal in this situation means not only the end of American body bags coming home, but the end of American body bags on this soil as a result of terrorist attacks. But second, we can focus our efforts on the enemy at hand, the enemy that is Al-Qaeda, the enemy that is now emboldened because the United States has been distracted by the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. Says Charles Pena of the Cato Institute for Public Policy Analysis, quote, "The war in Iraq was the wrong war because the enemy at the gates was and has been Al-Qaeda." Now, President Bush specifically stated in a public address on national television on September 7, 2003, that Iraq was the center of the war on terror, no longer Al-Qaeda. You all can, of course, see the problem with this, that we must focus all of our efforts, all of our energy on finding the men and women who 6 years ago caused two of our nation's finest buildings to go falling to the ground, taking more than 3,000 souls with them. The logical conclusion for all of us today is the affirmation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tokars. The time of that speech was 2 minutes and 56 seconds. However, since this is a sponsorship speech, 2 minutes of mandatory cross-ex will follow. Questioners rise now. Sir.
Thank you. Representative, you spoke of all these people that have died, yet how can we continue to honor their lives by ending our war?
It's simple. We can honor their lives by finally declaring victory in the war on terror once we finally destroy Al-Qaeda.
Ms. Deck.
How do you think that implementing this resolution would affect our relations with Europe and other members of the United Nations?
They would radically improve.
Ms. Dewey.
Would we leave special forces or small combat forces in Iraq after we pulled out all the other troops?
I think that might actually be a very good option so that we could ensure stability of the Iraqi government.
Ms. King.
Thank you, Representative. How do the G8 members feel about the war on terror?
I think most of the G8 members are very opposed to the war in Iraq, but they support the United States in their ongoing crusade against Al-Qaeda.
Mr. Woldemariam.
Because of the devastation which it has inadvertently brought on the Middle East, isn't the war on terror, if anything, simply promoting the spread of terror?
Exactly.
Mr. Stone.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Represented by this piece of legislation, are we necessarily pulling out of Iraq, or are we just placing this back in the hands of the legislature where it belongs?
I do believe that the power will return to this Congress where it belongs.
Thank you.
Mr. Kornfeld.
Do you perceive the war in Iraq to be a winnable conflict?
I do, but it would take a lot of time, a lot of effort, and things that the United States of America cannot afford, especially if we're waging war against Al-Qaeda.
Mr. Huff.
Isn't it true that the United States occupation of Afghanistan was in an effort to root out Al-Qaeda operatives?
Yes, and we have indeed rooted out many Al-Qaeda operatives in the region. Now the operatives are located in areas such as Pakistan and Iran, places we can't go militarily. The best option for the United States at this point is to pull back and defend against plots inside our own borders.
Ms. Buck.
Representative, could we still pursue Al-Qaeda without this war authorization?
Yes.
Mr. Colonel.
Mr. Tokars, what is the extent of this declaration?
Well, the declaration only technically ends the war in Afghanistan. However, it dramatically cuts the base of the President of the United States for the war in Iraq. This means essentially that we will, as a Congress, send a very strong symbol to the President of the United States that his war in Iraq must end, while at the same time ensuring that the Iraqi government remains strong and stable and the troops within the Middle East are not in danger.
Thank you, Mr. Tokars. You may be seated.
I do thank the Chair.
Negative speakers, please rise. Seeing as that everyone has spoken once, we'll move towards recency. If they're standing, Mr. Chavez, you are recognized.
Judges, once again, Representative Christian Chauvette, CHAUBET. I did not lose my $5 lunch. I lost it for 33 minutes, so.
At the leisure of the judges, sir.
Once again, I come before this chamber and to tell you that the previous senator was previous representative was misinformed. He told us that passing this piece of legislation would end the war in Iraq. But that's simply not true, because the authorization for force of military force against Iraq resolution was passed in 2002 and is not pertained to anywhere in this piece of legislation. But furthermore, just like I did with the Patriot Act, I will show you how this piece of legislation has indeed proven effective and how it indeed proves for our civil liberties, and therefore this piece of legislation must be negated in order to uphold our domestic security with the Patriot Act and our foreign security with the War on Terror. Which leads you directly to my first contention. The War on Terror is supported by our allies. Now, Section 16 of this piece of legislation tells us that our allies do not support us in the War on Terror, and this is inherently false. Now, if you look in the year 2001 and the year 2006, the United Nations Security Council unanimously supported the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan. Furthermore, 50 nations maintain a commitment to the situation in Afghanistan to this very day. Clearly, they support us in our fight against global terrorism. But furthermore, when we passed the authorization of force, we gave the president the power to do whatever was necessary to fight global terrorism. And along those lines, the president started sharing intelligence with our close allies. He started sharing intelligence with Britain, the EU, Indonesia, and Japan. And this has promoted effectiveness in foreign intelligence and effectiveness in fighting global terrorism, which leads me directly to my second contention. The war on terror is essential to our safety and has proven effective. Before I go any further, have there been any U.S. attacks on U.S. soil since 2001? No. It simply stated, combined with the Patriot Act, the war on terror has been supremely effective in fighting terrorism. Now we can look at specific examples and when plots were preempted internationally to stop them from coming to the U.S. Now along the lines of the international intelligence sharing I told you about, 16 bombers were arrested in Berlin as a result of this intelligence sharing with plans to bomb in America. Furthermore, on November 4, 2002, 6 al-Qaeda members were killed in Yemen with plans on them to harm Americans. Furthermore, on March 1st, 2003, al-Masari, a man on the FBI's most wanted list for planning bombings in the U.S., was killed due to the war on terror. Simply stated, representatives, the war on terror has protected our interests abroad. Furthermore, we must see that the war on terror has given the president the power to fight terror throughout the war. The United States has joined what is called a Joint Task Force on the Horn of Africa, which is combating terrorism in poor regions such as Africa, and has also allowed the president to deploy 1,300 troops in the Philippines, also to combat global terrorism. But what we must see is that since there have been no terrorist attacks, it's clearly been effective. But lastly, let's see how a war on terror is absolutely necessary, because without the war, we couldn't detain these terrorists, according to the case of the United States Supreme Court of Humpty. And it's because I'm out of time, and it's because this piece of legislation is effective, it's constitutional, and because our allies do support us that we must negate.
Thank you, sir. Please remain seated till the time is announced. The time of that speech was 3 minutes and 4 seconds. Now you may rise. Mr. Sun.
Can you tell me if terrorist attacks around the globe have gone up or down since the war on terror?
Representative, I'm talking about the U.S. security as a U.S. representative, and the U.S. maintains secure to this day.
Mr. Kassam.
What sort of message to send to the international community?
Can you clarify?
Could you please clarify, sir?
What sort of message does war in Iraq send to the international community?
Representative, what I'm saying is this piece of legislation today doesn't apply to the war in Iraq. The war in Iraq has a separate authorization of force. This is a completely different topic. That's off topic completely.
Mr. Ross.
Isn't exactly the problem the president can do whatever he deems necessary?
Once again, I couldn't
Could you
hear.
please clarify, sir?
Isn't exactly the problem that the president can do whatever he deems necessary?
I'm going to ask to move on. I can't hear him.
I apologize, sir. Mr. Blevins.
Yes, Representative, isn't it possible repealing the authorization for the war on terror could help us adapt a new and more effective strategy in fighting it?
No, I don't believe so, because I believe the current strategy, as I've proven, is effective. There haven't been any terrorist attacks, and combined with the Patriot Act, is proven an effective system. We shouldn't change it.
Ms. Mueller.
Representative, do all terrorists come from Afghanistan?
No, and that's why we have to fight a global war on terrorism. The United States is currently, like I told you, fighting terrorism in the Horn of Africa, in the Philippines, in Pakistan, and numerous other places around the world where terrorism and al-Qaeda have taken hold.
Thank you very much, sir. You may be seated. Affirmative speakers, please rise. Since everyone has spoken, we move towards recency. Mr. Stone.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
the judges, it's Representative Jordan Stone representing the Northern Illinois District. And as always, I will begin at the leisure of my presiding officer, as well as my judges. Just give me a nod whenever you're all ready.
At your leisure.
Since the inception of the United States Constitution, this government has bared in mind the idea of the balance of power, the idea that each sector of the government has certain rights and opportunities. And in this case, in the case of the use of the Authorization of Military Act that President Bush has been using over the last years, I think it's finally time for this Congress to understand that we need to get back the right to wage war, the right to send troops where we wish. However, it's not necessarily the constitutional argument that I'm arguing here, but simply the inefficiency of the executive branch when it comes to military action. And I'd like to examine this firstly in Iraq, and secondly in Afghanistan. Now, to move to my first point, representatives, is that the administration currently under the executive branch is actually being inefficient in the war in Iraq. Now, the most recent action by President Bush, as we can see, was a surge of 20,000 troops. And I'd like to analyze whether this was actually correct to do. Now, according to Ted Galen Carpenter of the Cato Institute on January 18, 2007, when analyzing the Iraq war itself, he says that the top counterinsurgency experts recommend that you have 1 troop for every 100 civilians, and in cases of a pervasive nature such as in Iraq, 1 for every 50. Now, when we take Iraq currently with a population of about 26 million people, that means that we should have, at minimum, 260,000 troops, and in order to fit the final qualification, 520,000 troops. And our current level of troops there, 150,000 representatives. So while President Bush may suggest that we put 20,000 troops in there and maybe increase the number to 170,000, I think it's important for this legislature to see that he clearly is misinformed, and therefore this Congress must take over. As we can see, that is nearly 100,000 troops less than the minimum, and almost 400,000 troops less than the maximum or the correct capacity that we should have in Iraq. Therefore, it's not even a matter of unconstitutionality in the case of Iraq, it's simply a matter of efficiency. Because now that this legislature knows what the problem is, we indeed can fix it by passing this piece of legislation. However, secondly, to move on to a war that I believe is a little bit less debated usually, the one in Afghanistan. Now, obviously, we went into Afghanistan with the best of intentions of rooting out the Taliban. However, according to a recent testimony by Jeffrey D. Record of Stanford University in front of Congress, what he stated was that what we failed to do in Afghanistan, and the reason for several of our casualties, is because we had untrained officers. But not necessarily just untrained in military standards, untrained in irregular warfare. Because as we know, when going into countries in the Middle East, they don't necessarily fight one person on one line, one person on the other. It is guerrilla warfare. And in that case, this executive branch of government has failed to train the military, has failed to recognize the fact that this is not warfare that can simply be fought by conventional military training. And therefore, representatives, it is in the idea of Montesquieu's balance of powers and in the idea of efficiency that we must pass this piece of legislation and take the power back that was taken by the executive branch. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Please remain seated until time is called. Thank you, sir. The time of that speech was exactly 3 minutes. Now you may rise. Mr. Hunt.
Do you feel that the new Congress would have a weak and efficient system?
I believe so. I believe this Congress would do a much better job of fixing the current system at hand than with the executive branch.
Ms. Deck.
Since 2001, since the inception of the War on Terror, over 5,000 terrorists have been caught. What do you have to say to that?
I entirely agree, and I think that's an excellent option here. However, that doesn't mean we still can't fight the war on terror. This Congress will still have the power to fight the war on terror, just it won't be in the hands of the executive branch.
Ms. Stewie.
How effective were President Clinton's forces sent to Bosnia without congressional approval?
Well, I'm not exactly sure of how effective they were. I haven't really studied it recently. From what I know, they were decently effective. However, to look at the current situation, we are not being entirely efficient, and therefore the power must be turned over to Congress.
Mr. Spitzer.
Thank you. Did the political pressure with the public outrage in the Iraq war allow President Bush to put in more than 20,000 troops?
Well, I don't really necessarily think it did, but as I'm stating, it would be more efficient in the mind of this Congress to have us controlling the war rather than President Bush, considering that he is completely oblivious of the current policy that needs to be instated.
Mr. Tokars.
I do thank the chair. Doesn't the congressman agree with me that the best way to end the war in Iraq is slowly through this piece of legislation which allows this Congress a base to overturn the resolution?
I would entirely agree with that, and I think this Congress needs to understand that it needs to take back the powers that were once its so that we can finally end this war.
Thank you very much, Representative. You may be seated.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir. Negative speakers, please rise. Mr. Huff? Oh, seeing as Miss... Ma'am, you do have the floor, followed by you, sir, Mr. Huff. At your leisure, ma'am.
In social psychology, there's a common term known as the foot in the door phenomenon, where on the part of an individual, if they make a small concession, it leads to much greater concessions. Unfortunately for us, this particular authorization that allowed the war on terror as well as the war in Afghanistan is the foot in Congress's door. It's the foot that led us to approving both the USA Patriot Act, the USA Victory Act, the Military Commissions Act, as well as the war in Iraq. Now, however, because we realize the big picture, that beyond this authorization, that President Bush has used the banner of the war on terror to dedicate known and potentially unknown U.S. resources to pursuing people and also organizations that he perceives as a threat to America's safety, we have to realize that just affirming this legislation isn't enough. And that's why I actually stand on negation. Because I believe that if we pass this legislation, what we would be doing is giving the Bush administration tacit approval of the way they have far overstepped the law we have drawn as the legislative body. And as such, I believe that instead we have to take further action and not just this insufficient one. Now, in terms of what Congress believes, I'm fully in agreement with the people on the affirmative side that enough has been enough. However, I don't think that just by repealing this act that we're actually going to stop President Bush's waging on the war on terror. Moreover, because now we finally have judicial support, as the New York Times of June 12, 2007 notes, a panel on the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals finally rejected the president's claim of being able to decide who the combatants were and to throw individuals into military prisons forever. The majority has been clear that the White House's policies have threatened the Constitution and the rule of law. Now, because both the judicial branch and the legislative branch assembled here today have concluded that President Bush does not just claim his war powers in times of great need, but sees them as an inherent power of the presidency that he can use whenever he likes, we have to realize that it's now time for us as the House of Representatives to commit our solemn, necessary, and ultimately constitutional duty in this time of constitutional crisis. And that is, I would actually urge you to negate this legislation and use it as further evidence for impeachment. In fact, I would call upon you to remember that in March of 2007, Foreign Policy noted that in the Nixon years, the House Judiciary Committee concluded that abuses did not have to violate the criminal code. And because President Bush has not yet been convicted of a criminal crime, but however, he has committed great and dangerous offenses that will subvert the Constitution, I believe we have full grounds to begin impeachment proceedings. Moreover, I believe that we should use how far he has overstepped the bounds of this authorization added to his illegal wiretapping program, his falsely justified war in Iraq, as well as the mistreatment of detainees in Guantanamo Bay and other prisons around the world, in order to say we're going to negate this legislation so that we can use this authorization as evidence that we're going to stand opposed to President Bush without actually agreeing with him. By affirming, once again, I have to remind you that what we're telling him is that his interpretation is correct, and now we're going to use this same interpretation to stop it. For all these reasons, I urge you to negate. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. The time of that speech was 3 minutes and 5 seconds. Questioners, please rise. Mr. Colonel.
Ms. Wong, would passing this piece of legislation hamper the United States' ability to retaliate to countries or terrorists?
I don't think so.
Mr. Kornfeld.
Wouldn't we get Cheney?
Pardon?
Could you please clarify, sir?
In your speech, you said that we should impeach President Bush. Wouldn't we get President Cheney in that case?
Potentially, but if Mr. Cheney is implicated as well, then we could potentially investigate him for impeachment as well.
Mr. Moshe.
Representative, do you think that the war on terror should be a war of military or a war of ideology?
I believe that the war on terror, we should pursue all effective channels, but at this point in time, we have a constitutional crisis because of how this administration has chosen to pursue the war on terror.
Mr. Hamilton.
Is it a worthwhile use of our effort and time to impeach a president who's a lame duck with only a year and a half left in office?
Just because he's lame duck doesn't mean he has essentially weakened the very foundation our democracy stands on.
Mr. Narayan.
What would be the effect of impeaching a president in a time of war?
First of all, he's used this very nebulous term of the war on terror to make us think that we're in perpetual crisis. Now, while it's true that hostile forces do threaten the United States, I believe that it's even more dangerous if we are attacked from the inside.
Thank you, ma'am. You may be seated.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Affirmative speakers, please rise. Out of all the standings, you have all spoken at least once. We'll now move towards recency. Ms. Mueller, you do have the floor, speaking at 6, followed by Ms. Bach.
Again, for the scores, it's Representative Marin Mueller from Texas's Lone Star District. Just give me a nod when you're ready.
At your leisure, ma'am.
Thank you. As we look to foreign policy today, the most frightening thing is that the words of Stephen Colbert have finally become clear. Instead of finding ourselves in Turkmenistan or even Afghanistan, we instead find that U.S. foreign policy has entered the point of absurdistan. Indeed, when we looked at how this Congress, as well as the President, is conducting foreign policy, it's becoming more and more unnerving just what we authorize him to do. So primarily, we can give ourselves a break and remember that the justifications for going into the war in Afghanistan were proven false ultimately. And thus, we need to take a hard look at both the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. As Human Rights Watch noted in 2004, quite clearly there were some very major human rights abuses happening by both Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. Yet the United States didn't take the best action possible in order to fight these human rights abusers. Indeed, if we truly want to help, Representative Chavez tells us that we need to look to how many bombings have been set off in the past 4 years. But representatives, this is like saying that the United States defense against unicorns is working well because we haven't seen any unicorns in the last 25 years. Indeed, if we look at something that simply hasn't been an issue and hasn't happened, it's becoming quite obvious that we need to find a new route which we can take. Indeed, Representative Wong, while you make an interesting point, today we have the chance to put our foot in the door and tell President Bush that we don't approve his military action and that we don't approve his strategies. Doing this in no matter how small a way will show him that we have some very serious implications for the future, and it will ultimately help us end the war in Afghanistan and in Iraq. But secondarily, we need to remember that history, representatives, is repeating itself. So if we look to the Vietnam War, as much as the president would have us believe that the two aren't the same at all, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution found Congress in the exact same situation. In 1965, after President LBJ sent troops into Vietnam, we found that there was a very major problem in that the US and the Congress didn't consent to this war and didn't consent to the actions of the president. Yet, we find that today we made the exact same mistake, authorizing more and more war powers that are piling up upon one another. So, the Washington Post recommended in December of 2006 that we take one simple action and remember that there is always something the US can do. It's never too late to take our words back if we truly realize that in the long run, it's not the best thing for our constituency. The simplest way to prove this, representatives, is by looking to a Gallup poll from last month. Only 23% of our constituency approves of the war in Iraq. So, sending President Bush the idea that the war in Afghanistan isn't okay and that the war in Iraq isn't okay either is the best way to keep ourselves from coming in between Iraq and a hard place when it comes to foreign policy.
Thank you, ma'am. The time of that speech was 2 minutes and 58 seconds. Questioners, please rise. Mr. Kassam.
Thanks, sir. Will ending the war on terror is the ideological message of defeat?
I don't think that war on terror is actually an accurate phrase. Instead, I would say we take an approach like Representative Colonel told us within the last piece of legislation and actually work on building up infrastructure in the Middle East, just as we want to do in Africa. That way we can truly end the sources of terror rather than killing terrorists only to be replaced by others.
Mr. Chavez.
Even though there's actual evidence of terrorists planning to bomb the U.S. and there's no actual evidence of unicorns, isn't that metaphor somewhat extravagant?
Well, Representative, my point is that it's really easy to say that we stop all future bombings from happening. But I truly think that the negative side of this resolution is over-exaggerating the threats to the United States, and we're using that as a fear tactic for our constituency.
Ms. Wong.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Mueller, even if we are rejecting the war on terror, what good does it do if we reject it on President Bush's terms instead of ours?
Well, that's just the thing. Because we're taking this matter into our own hands, I truly think this is on our own terms, and we're sending a very strong message as to what we do and don't believe.
Thank you very much. You may be seated.
I thank President Patel.
Negative speakers, please rise. Seeing as that everyone has spoken at least once, we'll now move to Mr. Rosen. You have the floor.
Once again, that's Representative Zach Rosen. As always, at the leisure of our wonderful judges, parliamentarian, and presiding officer.
At your leisure, sir.
Thank you. Our governmental system is so great because we have a system of checks and balances. This system ensures that we can oppose the highest elected official in our country, the president. And today, representatives, we have the opportunity to oppose our president with the legislation before us. Yet we have to recognize that voting in proponency of this legislation would not be a good option, and therefore our only option is to vote in negation. Now, Representatives, I lead you to a question asked by Representative Sun in cross-examination. He asked if terrorism is increasing or decreasing. And I'd like to lead you to my first point of analysis, that terrorism is actually growing, and therefore we must vote in negation on this bill to fight that growing increase. According to the Financial Times of London, May 1st, 2007, an annual U.S. State Department report on terrorism for 2006 concluded that Iran was still the most active sponsor of terrorism, but it warned that Al-Qaeda and its affiliates posed the greatest threat to the U.S. and the international community. The report found that there were more than 14,000 incidents of terrorism in 2006, an increase of 29% from the previous year. Representatives, terrorism is on a steady increase, and there is no way that we can combat terrorism effectively without failing this legislation. Which takes me to my second point, that we cannot fail this legislation because the war will not stop if we fail this legislation. According to The Independent on Sunday of January 1st, 2006, whether or not bin Laden is captured and what happens in Iraq, even if a genuine Arab democracy takes root and every American soldier leaves, hardly affects the prospect. In the modern era, guerrilla war lasts an average of 9 years. The Iraq insurgency has been underway for less than 3. The United States will remain the target choice for Islamic terrorists. The war on terror may yet acquire another name, but whatever it is called, it's here to stay, and we need to recognize that, Representatives. We may stop physically fighting, but the war will never be over because Islamic extremists and terrorists around the world will constantly point their targets at the United States. And that takes me to my third and final contention, that Representative Stone and Tokar's claims that we can still fight Al-Qaeda and other terrorists, but we cannot do it effectively if we were to pass this legislation. Representatives, we cannot give up in this growing conflict. According to the Boston Globe of July 3rd, 2006, we must recommit to the President's call for victory, one that will be many times more difficult than when the President spoke almost 5 years ago. Tens of thousands of new volunteers, Representatives, have joined Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and Hamas, and these terrorist organizations are still extremely strong. So Representatives, for those contentions, I urge you to fail this legislation, to recognize that our war on terror is not over, even if we stop physically fighting. We need to still be able to have our President declare war and continue to fight these terrorist organizations. I urge you all to vote in strong negation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The time of that speech was 2 minutes and 56 seconds. Questions, please rise. Ms. Mueller.
Thank you. Representative, aren't some of the tactics the U.S. is currently using cited as the reason why terrorism is increased?
Certainly, some of our military tactics are not as good as they could or should be, Representative, but through passing this legislation, our military tactics aren't going to get better. Our military tactics will completely disappear, thus allowing terrorism to increase threefold.
Mr. Ross.
Should the legislative branch be running wars?
I'm sorry, can the speaker
Could you please clarify, sir?
Should the legislative branch be running wars?
The legislative branch should not be running wars completely alone. We should have our say, and we do have our say with checks and balances, but our president does have a very good idea on how to work with that matter.
Mr. Narayan.
Isn't President Bush's war on terror increasing this causing the growing terrorism?
Absolutely not. President Bush's war on terror is there to decrease the war on terrorism. And as I stated, if we were to stop this war on terror, all of the Islamic extremists and all of the terrorists around the world are still going to continue hating the United States with as much passion regardless of whether our war is continuing.
Time has expired. Representative, thank you. You may be seated. Please state your motion.
Rise to point of personal privilege.
Please state that privilege.
We've just passed 1 hour. I'm moving for 10-minute recess.
I do.
I'm going to be asked. I'm the official timekeeper.